I'm Justin Crosley with the Brewing Network, and we are here at Troubadour Maltings in Fort Collins, Colorado, to check out what a artisan maltster looks like. I'm here with Chris Schooley, and he founded this company, 3 years ago?
We founded Troubadour probably closer to 5 years ago. As a process to put everything together. The equipment for doing malting at this scale didn't really exist at the time we started putting things together. So it took us a couple years just to kind of, work with some engineers and really figure out how we were going to do this in the first place.
Sure.
But we've been in production for almost 3 years in April. So.
Wow. And looking around, it doesn't actually look like malting is very difficult equipment-wise. It seems like all the expertise comes down to the science and how you use these things.
Absolutely. It's really about your personal involvement in the process. Malting in and of itself is you're tricking the seed to grow so that you can access its sugars, and all you're trying to do is really control that, control the environment so it will grow happily and evenly. But yeah, a big part of just knowing what's going on in the malting process and knowing what you're trying to develop, the flavors you're trying to develop, the sugars you're trying to access, has everything to do with just getting in the box and pulling samples and looking at the barley or the wheat or whatever the grain is that you're actually malting, and just paying attention to it and looking at it through various different specs as far as moisture, modification, sugars, things like that, but also a lot of just sensory involvement, which is a big part of it.
And malt is available on a large scale. It has been for eons, it seems like. So what is the difference? Why would a brewery, for example, want to purchase your malt?
Well, I think there's two big things at play here. One is that transparency. Right now, local is a really big thing. Like, people want to support local small businesses. Here at Troubadour, we actually, while we embrace that, we also try to be really careful with the way that we use that idea of local, because really when we talk about local, what we're really talking about is transparency and knowing where things came from. Okay. And it's about that storytelling, right? I mean, that's why we're Troubadour, is we want to tell a story. And so if we have a story to tell, why would we just slap a word on that encapsulates everything when we can actually tell a story, when we can really involve those proper nouns and the real people and places, like Mark Arnish or Greg Walker and Keensburg down in southeastern Weld County, or 3 miles down the road where all of our barley is stored. Really make those connections with people. So part of it is that transparency and the connectivity to that. But the bigger win of the transparency really is about that differentiation. Like you were saying, there's plenty of malts readily available for considerably cheaper,
Okay.
than a craft product. Just like craft beer, there's a lot of macro beer out there. There's a lot of, better, more quality, more nuanced beer out there we call craft. And that's really what we're trying to do with craft malts, is have things that are more nuanced and different,
Okay.
So a big part of it is just, finding our opportunities through the malting systems to develop really new and different flavors. Part of that is what we can do in the system itself, and part of that is just being able to deliver a fresher product. Brewers having a stake, being able to talk to their maltster, having connectivity to the grower, having connectivity to the breeder. When you get everybody in the supply chain talking together, that's where those exciting things happen. So that's where that customization is really comes into play, or that ability to. And it could even be as simple as, hey, we really like this, but we want something that, has a slightly different color to it, or we want something that, we're going to use for barreling. One thing for a perfect example of that is our Troubadour Rhapsody malt, which is a Bohemian style Pilsner malt. What that means is it's really just a slightly less modified malt.
Okay.
So we rather, like with most of our base malts, we try to get 100% modification of the seed. And when we talk about modification, we're just talking about the growth of the kernel, the acrospire of the plant growing along the kernel. So what we're looking for is that modification. With the Rhapsody, we talked to a couple different brewers who are making some Flanders red ales, or doing a lot of wild fermentation, cool ship brewing and whatnot, and they wanted longer food chains for the yeast to eat. And so by not modifying it as much, we were able to preserve some of those longer food chains, so that as those beers were sitting in their barrels, the yeast didn't just devour everything right away.
Right.
So it's one of those things, and that's a perfect example of that's a beer. Those styles of beers are commonly thought of as either wood driven or bug driven beers, but in actuality, malts play a super important role
Sure.
in all of that.
Excellent. And could you just give me the quick rundown of the process of malting? You get fresh barley in, and what happens from there?
Yeah, so either barley or wheat. We actually have a batch of wheat that's in the kiln right now, just about to wrap up to cure. But the malting process, like I said earlier, we're really trying to get the seed to grow. So in the field, you're really waiting for it to cure to a certain moisture content so that it will be stabilized for long-term storage. And so that at that point, the grain is sleeping, more or less. It's at a stable moisture content. It's not growing. It's just waiting. And so what we're doing in the malting process is first we have to rehydrate the grain so it wants to grow. So the first step is the steeping process, which is that rehydration. And what we're doing in that is we're doing a long-term soak. The steeping process will more or less take 48 hours depending on the product, depending on temperatures, things like that. But really what you're trying to do is get the moisture content up over that 40% moisture so that it wants to grow. And you can achieve that by, soaking for a period of time, but then you want to drain the water and let the seed breathe, push out that CO2, make room to take in more oxygen, more hydration so it wants to grow. So the steeping process, between some soaks and rests takes about 40 to 80 hours. After that, we transfer it over into the germ and kiln vessel.
Okay.
So the next step in the malting process is germination. Germination actually starts as soon as the seed is hydrated even a little bit. There's some growth going on there. What we're looking for in the steep tank is not just that moisture content, but just the very beginning of the rootlet development coming out of the bottom of the seed, what we call the chit, just like a little foot sticking out. You don't want to see it full on rooting out there because that would mean that it's starting to grow in a different environment than you've set up otherwise.
Okay.
So the next step is germination. In the germination, we're really trying to get, again, it's a temperature sensitive process, just like steeping. You can get things to happen faster at higher temperatures, but you also run the risk of damaging a lot of enzymes. And one of the secrets of craft, right, is patience and time. Just slow things down rather than trying to push things through. A lot of modern malting barley varieties have been bred to germinate really quickly because we're talking about industrial production. We want to make it as fast and as cheap as possible.
Sure.
So even though we're using some modern malting barley varieties, we still prefer to slow it down, keep it at a slightly lower temperature.
Okay.
So we just have more control over it. It's still a happy temperature for it to grow at.
Yeah.
But like I was saying earlier, in the germination process, if this is the kernel here, this is our rootlet growing out this way from the bottom. And the acrospire is like a little, you see like the little string of the plant just growing along the back, growing along the dorsal of the seed there. And so over the course of, 3 to 4 days, again, depending on the grain and temperatures and whatnot, you'll see that acrospire or the embryo of the plant grow all the way along the seed. And once it gets to the very tip, that's that 100% modification we're looking for. That's when you have the most access to the sugar. And that's what you're doing in germination, is getting access to the sugar. If the plant then starts to grow out of the seed, then it's going to start devouring that sugar for itself.
I see.
So what happens next? The next step in the malting process is kilning. And that's to stop the growth, for one, but also what you're doing in the kiln, that's really where you can start developing a lot of your different products.
Okay.
Depending on the way that you play with moisture content and sugar, you can engage a lot of different aromatic reactions, as well as sugar branding reactions to create color, to create mouthfeel and body, to help create head retention, just push a lot of flavor. That's one of those things is malts, are used for the sugar, of course, in brewing, but also, they play a major role in your mouthfeel, in your head retention, in the color. There's so many things that the malts are doing there, and those are the things that you can do in the kiln.
Okay.
Besides just drying it down and making it ready for the brewers. So steep germ kiln. Our system, we actually have designed it so that the steeping is separate from the germ and kiln box, and that's so that we could stagger batches. We're actually, while we're kilning right now this batch of Antero white wheat from Mark Arnish's farm, we're getting ready to load the steep tank with some barley from the 5 different barley growers we work with here in northern Colorado. So we can stagger our batches and just crank out beautiful sweet malts all day long.
And how many different malts do you offer right now?
Right now, we're working with about 8 or 9 different types of malt.
Okay.
We try to, we've tried to enter the market with delivering something that's really different and unique, but what's still being recognizable to brewers in terms of how they would use it.
Sure.
We want brewers to say, to know that they're going to get a different flavor, different attributes from this, but you can use it in this kind of context, like a Munich style or a Cara style malt or, an English pale style malt, but getting something that is just more evocative of Fort Collins, Colorado. So we have a couple different malts that we're working with regularly, around 8 or 9, like I said, and we've really focused on, again, not trying to match what's already readily available in mass and it's super cheap. Really, we've latched on to giving our malts really evocative names. I think that's a really important part of craft in general, is you have to capture people's attention. You have to capture their imagination and get them excited about something, but give them something to, if they have a beer that they like and they like that color or the flavor from the malt in it, and that brewer can say, oh, that comes from Troubadour Serenade.
Nice.
That's something, just like hops are so popular, because they're so aromatic and so noticeable, but at the same time, the brewer can say like, oh, well, that's Galaxy or Citra, or, there's a name, an exciting sounding name.
That's right.
That they can latch on, whereas most of the malts out there commercially available are named pretty generic terms,
Some of them even just named after the variety of barley, right?
Exactly.
I mean, you've got your 2-row and you've got...
Right, no, that's the whole thing, is there's a lot of folks you talk to now who say like, oh, well, I like 2-row malt. Well, it's like saying, Arabica coffee or something like that. It's really not indicative of what the malt itself is. It's just what the barley variety is, like you said. But we also try to keep space open, just like you were saying, for that customization or working on experimental grains. We have really good relationships with some of the larger flour mills in the area, and they're doing a lot of heritage grain products and work looking at those and trying to develop growing some of those heritage or heirloom varieties here in the state. So we're looking at some of that stuff, playing around with that as well. And that's part of the thing, is just keeping a spot open on our production to experiment in the same way that the brewers are experimenting, right? I mean, like creating that dynamic and that interplay, that conversation all across the board is really like the big win of craft malt, is, not just being able to know where things come from, but knowing that you're getting something truly unique and special.
Sounds amazing. Sounds like a good business you're growing here. Where can people go find out more information? What's the website?
You can go to troubadourmaltings.com.
Okay.
There's 2 U's in Troubadour and an S at the end, pluralized Maltings in the English style.
Got it.
And we're all over the internets with Facebook and Instagram. We really like to visually tell our story, so definitely find us on Instagram and follow us. So.
All right, thank you, Chris. Brewers, the new frontier in beer might just be malt, not hops, like you think. So, live from Troubadour Maltings in Fort Collins, Colorado. Thanks for having us, Chris.
Yeah, thanks so much.
The Brewing Network.